The camera is where?
The camera is this one.
Okay.
So that is seeing you.
Okay. And the microphone is that one. So does it catch us? Yeah. Shall I start?
You don't understand?
I start.
Yeah, that's that.
But then this one?
Yeah.
For whom is this thing?
But anyone who is talking, even
I'm supposed to do this? Yeah. But is that microphone?
this one is bad, but it goes both sides. So that you don't have to.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone here in Future Africa. You're most welcome. As you know, we kind of moved. Thank you. And you, I was coming to those online. You are just equally as welcome, certainly, wherever you find yourselves. We are seamlessly, in a way, moving from the Advanced Human Rights course as such into the Roundtable dialogue, all with the same theme, the right to development in Africa. Now, on Monday morning when we started, I had no reason really to welcome you, because at that time I was in a different country altogether. I was, in a sense, with a virtual crowd and not with you here in Future Africa. So it's really my privilege, and I'm very happy to be here physically with you. And I apologize, on the one hand, for not having been here in the week, and also for the fact that I will unfortunately have to rush out because of urgent center business now. But I look forward to meeting all of you again tomorrow. So I hope that most of us would be able to join for the roundtable for Saturday during the day. I want to welcome just a few people specifically here in Pretoria, maybe from my side for this first time. We're on the same ground, as it were. Professor Mihir Kanade, who is here from the University of Peace, but also member of the expert mechanism on the right to development. I know that he's been participating in the course, but just to mark the moment also, and to welcome you very specifically, and our well-standing collaborators from the University of Antwerp, Professor Koende Feiter and Professor Wouter van der Hoele. We really appreciate our long-standing cooperation that we just want to further strengthen. We appreciate your physically being here after the interruptions that had been caused. We also welcome and thank very much the head of delegation, we could say the ambassador, as it were, of the government. The government, let me not go there. I know that's a very loaded term. The government of Flanders, the delegation of Flanders here in South Africa. We have had a long-standing, to use the word again, a support relationship, collaboration with Flanders in terms of these advanced courses. One of the elements has certainly been the right to development. We thank you for that long-standing support and your presence here this afternoon. Thank you also for officiating on the course, on the program later this afternoon. It's really not for me to say anything. I'm not the expert, certainly in the room. I welcome all the other facilitators. I'm not going to go into details. You'll be introduced, and thank you very, very much for everyone's presence here. Just to say from my side, I think it's exciting that we have this roundtable, that we have this discussion on the right to development for two reasons, I think, beyond all the others. The first is, I think, with the African continental free trade coming into its own, 43 states have now already ratified the agreement. I think there are exciting avenues to explore, challenges to look into, and I'm glad to see that that aspect features on the program, and we will all look into also building on what we've done in the short course to look at how liberalization of trade, movement of people will fit into enhancing the right to development. And the second is something that we as a Center for Human Rights have been involved in, and that is a general comment that the African Commission had just in its private session adopted a general comment on the regulation by states of private actors that are involved in the provision of social services. So I think the whole theme of social services is also very central. I note in terms of the round table, public service, social service, and how that links to the right to development and the role of private actors, non-state actors in that regard. And very happy that someone who's been part of the drafting group will be introducing this, and that others who are also members of the drafting group are here today. You are most welcome. So I think there are exciting contemporaneous links that make the idea of the roundtable even more pertinent, on top of the fact that we have these lingering issues such as, what form does the right to development best take do we need a binding treaty? And we've had a discussion around the pros and the cons in the group, I know, earlier today. So once again, we look forward to your active participation in this roundtable. We thank you very much for your participation here, and we in particular look forward to continuing these discussions tomorrow with you. So I'm going to hand over to Professor Kunde Feiter, who will also say a few words of welcome on our co-host, essentially the University of Antwerp, and then the rest of the program will follow. Koen, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Professor Viljoen, for giving me the floor, and also on my behalf, welcome to all the participants in the roundtable. I'm more or less in the same situation as Professor Viljoen, as I also started this course virtually in Antwerp at home, and then was able to join you here. So I hope I'm now a member both of the physical crowd and the virtual crowd, that I've earned the right to be a member of both in a way. This is also to again celebrate the partnership with the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. We were trying to reconstruct over lunch how long we've actually been collaborating. I don't know whether we came to a final conclusion, but it must be 7 or 8 years, always also with the support of the Flemish community that has supports not just the collaboration with Antwerp University, but also with 2 other main universities in Flanders. And obviously, we're very grateful for the support over the years. I think it's very appropriate that we have a roundtable discussion on the right to development in Pretoria, in South Africa, in Africa, because one should not forget that to a large extent, the right to development is part of an African legacy. It's an important contribution from Africa to the development, first at the regional level of human rights, but also now at the global level. And sometimes we, in the United Nations, we tend to forget that the origins and the front runners on the right to development have been African scholars, right? And all the more reason, in a way, to make sure that in the current developments on the right to development, including on the new convention on the right to development, are also influenced by African thinking. I think that's really important, and that's it's also sort of an assignment for the new generation of African scholars to keep that tradition of African participation in the global human rights debate alive and kicking. If I may put up my other hats for a minute, I'm together with Mihir Kanade, also a member of the expert mechanism on the right to development that was created as a sort of think tank on the right to development. We're not so much involved in that capacity in the drafting of the convention, but more in thinking on how the right to development can be operationalized. Whether we can identify best practices, whether we can support litigation on the right to development, both at the domestic level and in international environments such as, say, international arbitration, where human rights concerns are often not taken into account sufficiently. So also for that reason, I hope that the roundtable can offer an inspiration also to the work that we are doing at the level of the expert mechanism, and I'm also thankful for the opportunity in that context. Okay, so let's start the substantive part, let's say, of the meeting, and for that I'm more than happy to give the floor to my colleague, the Human Rights Chair at the University in Antwerp, where we both come from, Professor Wouter van der Hoorn. Wouter, you have the floor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. Good afternoon. I have kind of decided not to start anymore with disclaimers usually, but I think I should start with a disclaimer, and that is that I kind of jumped off the plane like 2 hours or so ago, and so I feel my brain is still a bit slow. So it could be that when I'm going through my presentation that I kind of rediscover some of my slides and have to think first, what was the point I was trying to make? But let me maybe go back to where it started for us together when I taught a class on human rights-based approaches to development. You could say a more introductory class at the beginning of the program on Tuesday. And so in a way, we continue that conversation, you could say, partly with the introductory points that I would like to make here on the specific topic then of conflicts or the conflict of priorities, which was also selected as an important topic for the roundtable on the right to development. And perhaps it's good to clarify that although each of the right to development, human rights-based approach to development may have their own technical meaning, we very often also use the concepts to some extent even interchangeably. And some people so would say that there are 7 ways of doing a human rights-based approach to development, and one is through the right to development. So don't get confused too much there with the conceptualizations. The focus is indeed on the right to development, but human rights-based approaches to development are then also very often seen as either a catch-all phrase, but the way I would like to approach it is, as I did last Tuesday, by at least a starting point, taking it in its more technical meaning. And so in a way, in its operational meaning, and the way donors very often would try to apply the right to development in practice by adopting such a human rights-based approach to development. I kind of readily agreed to talk about conflicting priorities until I started to prepare it. And then I wondered, what do I want to say about it? And so I decided, let's focus on 2 issues. I think there is the first issue of conflicting priorities from a human rights point of view, and particularly human rights law, legal point of view, whether one can prioritize certain human rights over others, whether one should prioritize certain human rights over others, and if so, on what grounds one could do that. That's a particular challenge that practitioners will often raise from the beginning. If I go through the kind of the trainings I often did, or the workshops with development practitioners in a number of countries, mainly governmental actors, that was always a question that came up. Can we decide to focus primarily on education to the exclusion of health? Or can we focus on social security and then not do particular work on education and health? Is that possible under the human rights-based approach? And how can we legitimize that? And on which grounds should we make a decision, and so on and so on. So there's a whole question of prioritization of particular human rights over others in a rights-based approach to development, because the starting point for development practitioners is very much resources are limited. Human rights people may think they are not, but we know they are limited, and so we have to make choices. And in literature, it's often referred to as trade-offs. That's why I'm flagging here that word as well, because it will come back. But there is as much, I think, that question of conflicting priorities built into the concept of development itself, I would like to argue. And in particular with the notion of sustainable development that is being used more and more, there is the question of the so many pillars. Very often we would refer to at least 3 pillars. The human dimension, social dimension, which then is reflected in human rights, the economic dimension, and the environmental or ecological dimension. And so there, the question is also, should we argue from a human rights perspective that human development, social development, is to be prioritized over economic development or environmentally sustainable development. So these are the topics about which I would like to share some initial thoughts. And as I understand it, there will then be 3 colleagues who, to some extent from their own backgrounds, will respond to that, after which we would open the floor for discussion. So let me take you back, and I hope this is not too pedantic, but let me take you back to the definitions of human rights-based approaches that I introduced on Tuesday. And now look at them from that perspective. Do they help us? Do they assist us in addressing that question of conflicts of human rights? Do they tell us which human rights to prioritize? But if you go by the UN Common Understanding, and I have highlighted some of the text by putting it into italics and in red, so that's my emphasis added there. You see a reference to furthering the realization of human rights. I now realize it doesn't say realization of all human rights, so you could read into it a possibility for selectivity or prioritization, but clearly there is as such then no further indication how that prioritization could take place. If you go for the definition offered by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, there clearly in terms of development, there seems to be an emphasis, well, there is an emphasis on human development. Possibly, not necessarily to the exclusion of, but possibly as a way of arguing that when you do a human rights-based approach to development, you do prioritize in a way human development and not so much economic or environmental elements of development. And then again, a general reference to human rights without any indication of prioritization there. So let me take you one step further then also to the human rights principles that we discussed and that you undoubtedly remember, the kind of the 4 human rights principles that one would find to characterize and implement a human rights-based approach to development. And there again, at first sight, I would say no indications of prioritization. Perhaps if you want to see an element of prioritization, it is true that when we talk about the principle of non-discrimination and equality, that very often that is understood in the context of a human rights-based approach to development as requiring a prioritization of human rights of vulnerable groups. And then, of course, we may have to discuss who are these vulnerable groups. Are all their rights prioritized? Are particular rights prioritized? Those that relate to their vulnerability and so on. So still many questions there in terms of prioritization, but at least there is there indeed an entry point to look at. So that hopefully makes clear that there is clearly in practice, I would argue, a question of prioritization, which has not been really addressed in some of the key elements we have, the definitions, the principles we have related to human rights-based approach to development. So perhaps we find it more if we go to the hard core of human rights in a way to the legal instruments or the further legal codification of human rights. Perhaps there we find some elements that can help us in that question of prioritization. And so I will become a bit more technical now in terms of human rights law also. I haven't done a background check on everyone who is present here, so I'm even not aware of how many people have a legal background. I'll do this pretty fast because I promised also not to speak for too long. But we can come back, of course, to all these issues if we want in the discussion, and there will be ample time for discussion. The idea is that we only speak for half the time, the 4 of us, and then the remaining hour is for discussion. If we look at the draft convention on the right to development, I was kind of discovering when I went back to the text of that draft convention that I was not only finding what you would find in many political statements on human rights and also typically in preambles of human rights instruments and so on, and that is that all human rights are universal, inalienable, interrelated, interdependent, indivisible. That's the language we know. But what struck me in the draft convention on the right to development is that it says, and equally important. And that seems to suggest, in my reading, I'm curious to hear from those who have been much more involved in the process of drafting the convention, whether there's more behind it, but it seems to suggest that prioritization is not very easy, because they're all equally important, including the right to development itself. And then again, in that second paragraph of draft Article 6, it also says that the right to development is an integral part of human rights. And that's a point worth mentioning, of course, in a draft convention on the right to development. And again, that it should be realized in conformity with the full range of the kind of existing human rights, long-standing human rights of the so-called first and second generation civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights. So there, I don't see any indication of an inclination to prioritization, or even perhaps much space for prioritization at the conceptual level. If I move on to what is then very often argued in relation to human rights-based approaches, at least in literature, is, and I quote here Gary, who wrote in 2004 that rights-based approaches do not offer an explicit metric for making trade-offs, for deciding on prioritization, and are in fact premised on the incommensurability, typo there, of human dignity. So going back to that point of all human rights are interrelated and interdependent, and are equally important in a way. And so do not expect any clues to prioritization, the message seems to be. On the other hand, there's two authors who recently published an interesting piece where they identify all the types of trade-off that they see in human rights-based approach to development. I won't go through the whole grid, but just to say how many challenges there then are, how many questions for prioritization there are in practice. And you see there is a tendency there to, one could say, to ignore what is needed in practice, kind of starting points for prioritization of human rights or in human rights-based approaches to development. So let's see what we could find in human rights law. And so I already flagged the idea of indivisibility of all human rights, which at first sight kind of excludes or limits at least the space for prioritization. But then I think the reality is that, legally speaking, at least within the category of civil and political rights, we do see a degree of prioritization. We do make a distinction between derogable and non-derogable rights. So some rights you can in a way suspend as a state in a state of emergency. These are derogable, and other rights can, even in a state of emergency, cannot be suspended. So that, I would argue, is a kind of prioritization. The non-derogable rights are prioritized there. We also are quite familiar as human rights lawyers with the distinction between so-called absolute rights, no exceptions possible, no limitations possible, and relative rights, where we say, well, very often it's all about balancing that right with another right or with another interest, and then we apply kind of procedural checks to see whether that balancing is done in a proper way. You need to have a legal foundation, there needs to be a legitimate aim, you need to have proportionality. So there again, I think one can argue that absolute rights, like prohibition of torture, for example, are prioritized in a way over other rights, like, for example, the right to private life. I think more generally, so moving beyond the specific category of civil and political rights, there is a degree of prioritization within human rights law. And I've listed a couple of points where maybe not always fully thought through, but where you see that prioritization. One is that we accept that there are immediate obligations for all human rights, also for economic, social, and cultural rights, for example. And on the other hand, then other obligations, parts of rights that are subject to progressive realization because of budget constraints. So again, there is a dimension of prioritization there in the nature of the obligations we identify. There is the prioritization of vulnerable groups, which is not specific only for a human rights-based approach, but one will read it often in general comments of UN committees, for example, that they will, certainly the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights will call for prioritization of the rights of vulnerable groups. There's also a prioritization within each right, where it's argued that there is a hard core or a very essence of the right, and the language may differ a little bit, but again, across civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, that language is used to say, well, that at least should be realized even when there are resource constraints. And those two, prioritization of vulnerable groups and hardcore of the right, is what Semina and Kleine-Detes in their 2020 publication called the priority for minima. So they do not necessarily think it's a good thing, but at least we see it there. What has also been argued, but where I think there is less or potentially less support for, is the exceptionality argument. We used to do quite some work as a law development research group at the University of Antwerp with colleagues who were working in the area of public health, and they would often use the exceptionality argument. The right to health is so exceptional that you have to prioritize it, because if people are not healthy, they can't realize other human rights. If you look at general comments of the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, again, you will find an argument in quite a number of general comments for quite a number of rights. The same has been argued for the right to education. First, people need education. And others have said, first, people need food. And then you can talk about education and health and so on. So I'm personally not convinced that we have good grounds for developing such an exceptionality argument and in that way prioritize certain rights over others, but it's worth mentioning it. And it shows that all in all, I would argue that we do have quite a number of principles. Do they help us to make a decision in the abstract on how to prioritize? Certainly not, I would argue. And so what in some of the literature on human rights-based approaches, in particular, the literature produced in dialogue with practitioners or by practitioners, what is then pointed out is that we may need principles. We certainly also need to pay attention to circumstances. So maybe the prioritization is not to be made at the level of principles, but hands-on in the specific setting context in which one finds oneself. And you need fair procedures. If you can't decide as a matter of principle which rights should be prioritized, whose rights potentially should be prioritized, then you need to have fair procedures to make that decision of prioritization. And I think in a way that brings us back to the whole idea of participation, which is a key element, I think, both in the right to development and in human rights-based approaches to development. I kind of announced a second dimension of prioritization discussions, not only with regard to human rights, but also with regard to development dimension. But I also committed to being short to Arnold. So I'll do this pretty fast, and also because I assume this is perhaps already common knowledge for many of us. And again, we can come back to it then in the discussion. So just as a very quick reminder, this whole idea of sustainable development, where typically one would talk about these 3 Ps as 3 pillars: profit, people, and planet, referring to the economic, social, and environmental dimension. And then in the 2030 agenda, some other pillars were added, partnership and peace, and profit was kind of repackaged as prosperity. But we still have this idea of development has different dimensions, and at least these 3 core dimensions. And the question is, what do you do if they conflict with each other? And I noticed again in the course of this week that you have discussed the Endroys case, not only the Endroys case, but also the Endroys case, which I think, although in the reasoning and so on, it's less prominent, but there is clearly at kind of the starting point of the case was clearly a tension, and it was argued in a way also by the state that there was a tension there between, on the one hand, you could say the people, the social dimension, and then dimension of economic development and ecological protection. The interesting point that the African Commission makes here in this paragraph is, of course, that they are not necessarily in conflict with each other, and that could also be an issue for debate, whether I'm overemphasizing the kind of the conflicts and the need for prioritization, and maybe you can reconcile them. But just to say that I think, again, we see very often in many cases, legal cases, but also in real life cases, that tension between these 3 pillars. If we look at the draft convention on the right to development, clearly the idea is there also that one should not so much look for prioritization, but for reconciliation of the 3 menaces in a balanced and integrated manner. The 3 dimensions should be achieved, it says in the preamble. Now, that is what in the literature has been called a weak definition of sustainable development, where the argument, in fact, is sustainable development is about balancing the different pillars. It's about balancing. It's not about prioritization, right? And so they are not really in conflict. You can always find a way of balancing them, of kind of keeping them in balance. In stronger definitions of sustainable development, it's been argued that the environmental principle, the planet, the P of planet, should prevail over the 2 others. Why? Well, basically because of this, that we know from science, from hard science, that there are planetary boundaries, that we are exceeding some of these planetary boundaries, which is in kind of the dark orange here, that we are at the risk of kind of exceeding these planetary limits, these planetary boundaries, what is here in the light orange. And so that there is no other option, if we take hard science seriously, than to go for a strong definition for sustainable development, and so meaning that the environmental principle may prevail over the economic one and over the social one. And the question is that, what does that mean for human rights and for prioritization within human rights, if we have to accept that the environmental principle may prevail over so planet over people. Anyway. So that brings me to my VT conclusions. And VT here stands for very tentative conclusions. So very tentative in the sense that I have not presented, I think, strong and clear-cut solutions. And of course, in discussions with practitioners, that would often be what they would expect from the consultant, that you give them a couple of tricks how to solve these dilemmas. So I think that there are very much dilemmas. But on the other hand, the conflict of priorities, I think, is also really real. But not properly addressed in the high-level definitions and instruments we have, to some extent in human rights law, but then in a much more technical way. And so I think much more thought should also be given to these other 2 elements that came up in the literature. In addition to principles to manage conflicts, we also really need to understand and engage with context and situation. The question is, how do you do that in a good way? And certainly also pay then attention to procedures through which decisions on priorities are made. So I'll end here, and I apologize for taking slightly longer than promised. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that I'm now kind of putting out the hat of chair of the session also, and inviting then 3 respondents to take the floor first. And we would have the 3 respondents in a row, and then open the floor for discussion. And perhaps haven't been able to meet the people, so it's a bit embarrassing now that I even don't know which direction to look into. But we have Mrs. Alana Kembabazi, who will talk about development and public services, reclaiming public services for inclusive and sustainable development. We have Thomas White, who will talk about the African Commission General Comment on state obligations to regulate private actors involved in the provision of social services, at which Professor Viljoen already hinted. And then also Ms. Twazima Patricia, the role of philanthropy towards sustainable development, strengthening access to social services as a measure for human capital development. And now I know where to look, because they're all 3 here. Most welcome, and nice to meet you already this way. So I think there are mics, but maybe you find it also convenient to just use this one at this stage. No, I keep that one. Okay.
But I have to
Yes.
move the- If you want, we can do it now. Please come.
Hi, my name is I don't know.
Okay, I'll help you now. Okay, we have to introduce first.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm really glad to be here, and it's a pleasure to come up with such a fascinating presentation. One of the challenges that we face as activists when we talk about human rights is that the people come back to us with what we prioritize, like everything is coming with us, and in the shelf of their own human rights. So where we come to reflecting on the presentation, I think, I mean, it will be that human rights will do a lot more on providing guidance on how to prioritize. I think it does for those rights a bit more by providing responses, asking the but also asking to show that this is the maximum of development because of prioritization inherently in that. But getting back on the process here, so I want to talk a bit about how this started in the right development. And because I think when you're thinking about how to make economic social rights real with people, you're starting with the planning, you're thinking right now, you're planning, people have also, they have this, drugs in their facilities. You think about the electricity, which some are not direct rights, but then are, very much other with sources and advocated, and for example, the ICSDR and the kind of living. And for many of us, particularly in Africa, public services is where we fall short, whether it's access to water or healthcare, or education. And I was very much involved in trying to do mastery in public services. Honestly, a people really want to do a method. And wanted to
I don't want to confirm that quality public social services in areas such as health and education is critical to the realization of social and economic rights for all. Quality public social services are key to ensuring equality and inclusion for all groups in society. Enable people to live in dignity and achieve better standards of living, better for all people, including the poor and most vulnerable. In the next phase of ISA, we are growing commitment to reclaim public social services. Therefore, we demand that government strengthen public social service delivery. Government remains in control of the provision of quality public social services. Quality public health and education must be free for all. Government must invest in quality public social services. Public social services be financed through progressive taxation. Government refrain from commercializing and privatizing essential public social services. Public funds must not finance for-profit entities involved in social services. Government strengthens regulatory framework for private actors in social services. The public needs participants in designing and monitoring public social services. And it's really sure that I think being some of the key demands, but I think for us, we probably already state what we think should be a key priority, which is public services. And we talk about it because we realize, and particularly COVID-19, that everyone depends on them, and they're increasingly under threat. Because due to influence, whether it's from financial institutions, or even from countries that are doing well, they are told our country is idealistic to be required to provide healthcare, for example, or education. There's been questions about whether or not we're not going to have enough education in theory, but there have been questions about whether we should have any form of free education or any form of free healthcare. Reflecting on it from a right-based approach, I think for us the issue of habitat became also just what we're going to be saying. And also I think that there are ways to reach the kind of prioritization by emphasizing education, taking the right education. How many of you understand that there are certain things that are coming through very strongly? One of the threats we have seen, I want to talk a bit about, we can talk about the general comment, but I've been the value prioritization of this public, which then undermines the rights, undermines the right to healthcare, undermines the right to education. Well, we have seen the state step back, whether because it has a lot of, it's spending a lot of debt balancing with on that, whether it is just telling you how to particularly right now, of the rights. So increasingly stepping back, leaving this to the market. And the implications of that is to create a very unequal access to it. Now, at the global level, we've also been involved in the public sector. Sometimes I've had very heated arguments with my counterparts to the human rights. They're very well meaning to say, must the state provide public service? Is it okay if you just create alienating environment? And come back and say, well, in the African context in particular, we must have something that Thomas will talk about free healthcare and education, and the state providing it. This seems like a non-radical idea for us when we read sort of what human rights law says, and when we look at our context with others, for example, basically. But we strongly believe that if you are thinking about the right to development, not just where one is the goal, we cannot hear you. Oh, hi. Can you hear me now? Can someone let me know on the online class? I want to not connected. I'm just not calling you the main question.
Yes.
But the mask is a second voice. I've been doing this for 2 years. So I think it's a question about the transition. Yeah, so I want to be proud then, just in case, the issues with the way I'm speaking. But getting back to this, is how do we make sure that we don't have a disconnect between what, just how regular folk in our community are experiencing their country development and the problems of human rights.
And that's, I think, why it's very important for us to prioritize public services. We are going to communities and talk about rights. And people are saying these things are all set inventions. And it's hard to say no. See, this is very important because we don't have healthcare. We don't have drugs in the environment, for example, we don't have things. So there's a lot of assisted drugs so far in public property. So these are rights issues. And I think that as human rights advocates or as academia, we have not done a very good job of translating human rights as concrete political demands that people can make of their electorate. Or they are trying to get into power. I mean, that was a unique experience of the people because how often they budgeted for, unless there are demands are made by the people. Because it's on the one hand, good to imagine that our government are going to budget for everything that is a human right and think about it. But like you say, we are facing a challenge of prioritization. And how do you make, that's where the people's voice is important. And that's why it's also important for us to ensure that when we talk about rights, people are able to experience them concretely. And everyone knows the struggle, for example, with electricity. You know, trying to so the government have an obligation to provide. When it provides, it must be free. And how does it take into account vulnerabilities? And you don't see that conversation happening in a lot of nuance. Similarly with water, I'm expecting the African Commission's guidance on water is really interesting because it does get into it. It was a thorny issue for so long. In most parts of Africa, we don't have access to safe water, and when we do, it's don't charge. And we have setbacks, and one is making the link, for example, with the World Bank privatization that transformed that unequally skewed the distribution of water in countries like Tanzania and other countries of Africa. And then linking it back to the contract that are signed, and linking it back to the fact that you're looking at it from a rights-based approach. There's a lot more to take against our issue. And if you look at it from a rights-based development approach, I think that's the reason because they think that the sorting them in a particular article is a bit more difficult, right? Because again, we are not at the table when a lot of these discussions are happening. And so it's really, really important that we have a holistic approach to development because it means that we think about public services, we think about quality. You know, when you're talking about the financing and debt, you are interrogating their impact on development in two ways. Not just in terms of the money that is lost, the debt servicing that we use for public services, for example, in Uganda, 5 days of debt servicing could finance our entire short national budget. You're not just looking at that, you're also looking at the conditionality. That means that if they tell you have to start spending, you want to public services, you're looking at country ownership in terms of development strategy. And at the heart of it, what I love about the right development is that people are the focus. So you're not talking about human rights theoretically. And when you're having people look at the focus, they do the focus, there's a thing in focus. And the public services, for example, deliver. And are they accountable? Are we able to have participating people? Are they accountable to people? So I think that it's really important that we begin to link what has sometimes called the trial development issues to rights and speak about them more holistically. Because otherwise, then you're now that you read, you're hoping, okay, education, yes, you have to be education, you have to take and provide. None of them will provide. For this one, you don't have to provide. But you know, you're playing games instead of looking at the reality of the people and putting humans and the focus. So,
Thank you very much for that. And so I suggest we then stick to, if that is okay, to the order in which you appear in the program. So I'm happy to give the floor then to Thomas, please.
Thanks everyone. That's all. Sabotage. Okay, all right. Thanks everyone. It's really great to be here. Let me start by saying that I really encourage everything. I'm really fascinated by the presentation about prioritization. It's something we think about along the context of progressive realization, but not in the context of the right development. So I think that's a refreshing angle. When you watch the video that Alana played, and this is some of the points she made, one of the key takeaways is that the actors that are involved in the provision of social services is beginning to diversify. In many contexts, it's no longer just the state, it's now the private sector, it's now civil society, it's now a commercial enterprise. And the question we need to ask ourselves is when the nature of the actors diversifies, is it having positive consequences for the rights bearer? And increasingly in the African continent, we're seeing that the number of actors that are emerging in the private sector with respect to provision of social services is having detrimental consequences on the enjoyment of economic, social, and on the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights. And this is a profound problem because the lex lata, the current legal framework, is quite favorable to the privatization of essential services. One of the culprits of this is the Economic Commission on Social and Cultural Rights' General Comment number 3, where there is a very heated debate about privatization, and the committee adopts the approach that the state and the private actor are almost interchangeable. It adopts a neutral approach so that you can switch out the state provision of social services with the private provision of social services, and this has neutral consequences. But we've seen in Africa this isn't the case, largely because when you introduce a commercial profit-seeking private actor into a sector like education, into a sector like healthcare, they bring with them a different logic, the kind of logic that profoundly alters who receives services first, and what qualities and services are made available, and then I think most importantly, at what cost those services are made available. So these have far-reaching implications for the enjoyment of human rights. And in this general comment, the African Commission, and I think this is one of the bravest things that the Commission does, and it charts a clear course separately from the approach taken from the ICPSCR. And in this way, we are beginning to indigenize economic, social, and cultural rights, making them a lot more relevant to the African context. Yeah, so let's leave it at that.
Okay, then I think with that cliffhanger, because I haven't read the general comments, so I'm now very curious how that is done. So that will be a question for the round and of discussion and questions and debate. So,
Okay.
Patricia, yeah, yes.
So I have a difficult task sitting here as I think one of the other actors and trying to justify why philanthropy makes sense in advancing sustainable development. So firstly, of course, it's important to situate philanthropy within general development work and recognize that it's still very much part of aid and development that has been structured in a way that alludes to continents and places in the world that are poor and in need of perpetual saving and are incapable of fully conceptualizing and developing their own development agendas, right? So I recognize that. And so these ideologies have guided and shaped the ways in which development work and philanthropy, for the most part, have been structured. And now with the rise of new private donors that have expanded, right? This brings back the debate regarding aid and strategies, delivery methods, and the varied interests of the people who do development work and how they affect us, people who are in need of these key services, people who do live these different realities. So as the international private giving grows, the number of foundations, private and otherwise, has also exploded, right? So now small foundations have grown faster than the rest, And the aid landscape now includes thousands of privately funded non-government organizations, particularly in countries like Africa. In countries like Uganda, we're now seeing an increase of private funders, private philanthropies who are now we're tilting the ways in which we're experiencing development, right? It's also important to note that traditional philanthropy is still very much rooted in capitalist approaches, which expect tangible and almost immediate results in exchange for capital, right? But we understand that social change and systemic development is far more complex than that, and that money doesn't always lead to instant results. But what it does do is that it provides a cushion of time, which is necessary and a valuable asset for the development, for the different development agendas that we have. So philanthropic flows are still modest in volume, of course, compared to official development assistance. It accounts for about 5%. But there are still key players in significant sectors such as health, such as education, livelihood support. So while some philanthropic organizations are more finely tuned to, understanding the context and being able to change and fine-tune their models, the reality is that most of them are still structured on old age aid modalities that are poorly adaptable in domestic context. So I guess the question then is, how do we move on from here to more sustainable models of development, and what specifically is private philanthropy's role in strengthening access to key social services, right? So sustainable development has emerged from the realization that exploitative modes of development are unsustainable and unfit for world, particularly with such limited resources. We no longer have the luxury of defining development to entail limitless use and consumption of natural resources to create economic growth. So now, free from any type of political pressure, particularly private philanthropy, can explore new solutions to these social problems that are independent of most multinational and bilateral funding, right? So there is therefore potential to make more effective use of already scarce resources, especially if there is a commitment to give and fund directly to those who are focused on providing key social services, and hopefully in a less taxing and more humane and dignified way. So I guess the question is how. One, my thesis is that one must begin by situating philanthropy as an effective support partner. And the word support is important. Support partner that complements governments and in-country institutions to seek policy reforms, address gaps in social services, accelerate innovation, and generate new mechanisms for public sector accountability and justice. This could perhaps also help address the international global governance gap by taking into account the full realities that affect and hinder African states' ability to effectively provide key social services to their citizens. So persistent challenges like poverty, education, different health gaps, questions of inequality, etc., cannot be solved by a magic bullet, right? And so we have to understand that progress ought to be gradual, perhaps slow, but the goal for any meaningful kind of philanthropic investment has to be geared towards long-term, equitable, and sustainable progress. And the funding must begin to be able to reflect this, right? So we're talking funding directly to institutions that are seeking to close this gap. We're talking unrestricted and core institutional funding, funding in ways that allow for this long-term progress to actually be possible. The other thing is that philanthropy can begin to advance the state of knowledge and practice that actually allows for self-determination and allowing for the different polarities to exist. So knowing that communities and states are not monolithic, and that it also makes sense for different communities to be able to set their own needs and their own development agendas, right? So we are in dire need of knowledge and practices that can be able to evidence the. And so I think philanthropy can create a greater value by beginning to fund research and systematic progression of projects and that produce more effective ways for communities to address their own social problems, right? Finally, I would like for us to perhaps expand the understanding of key social services, particularly if we understand that the right to development is broad and expansive, beyond simply economic considerations. Wait, is that my Oscar cue music? If we begin to understand development as broad and expansive, beyond simply just economic considerations, but also include the full spectrum of human well-being, right? This means physical, mental, emotional, social considerations. This, of course, also requires that we pivot away from traditional aid models, away from poverty porn, etc., to radically reimagine, right, what societies in Africa actually want and need. We have to be very careful to disentangle ourselves from the traps that have forced us to determine and define people based on their challenges and not their aspirations. Because we also recognize that African children too deserve to see their aspirations and dreams made back to them, right? For so long, the focus on development has been on what is broken in our societies and not enough on what is wanting. And my argument is that this thinking has forced people to be identified only and primarily by these challenges, right? And so we have not done a good job of actively funding and the alternatives, right? Even if it's just the alternative of thought, the alternative of imagination, right? Particularly on the African continent. And so this requires that philanthropy is done better with models that are rooted in understanding that African people are better suited to self-determine, models of philanthropy that are context-based, that are trust-based, and that center local leadership at the heart of it all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm happy now to open the floor. I would suggest, in the interest of time, also that we don't have a first round amongst ourselves, but immediately now open the floor for questions and comments. It's probably useful if you want to address a particular member of the panel that you identify also the person whom you are asking your question to or making your comment to. If it is a more open question to anyone who wants to respond, that's fine too. And I suggest we take a couple of questions first so that we go in rounds, and then we'll see who can engage in the discussion. So since I wanted to prioritize the people now online, but since we are still sorting out some of the technical issues, I suggest we do start here. Shall I? Yeah. Will you take a mic or we'll change mics?
Thank you so much. Thank you to all the presenters. I have to say that your presentation was okay. No? Want to hold here?
Yes, not here.
Oh, okay. Right. Your presentations, particularly the opening presentation, Prof, and the last, took me back to 1996. My gray hair, everything. What are you talking about here? In 1996, 2 years after our first democratic election in South Africa, I was running a university-based law firm, and we had this shadow issue that we're talking about that faced us in stark reality, where we were representing a group of land claimants, people who had been dispossessed of their land under apartheid, against a newly elected provincial government, who were now trying to fulfill the right to housing of the current homeless people. So there we had we had this conflict, let me say the conflict first, between land claimants, historical land claimants, and homeless people of today. And the government at that time decided that they were going to invoke a procedure in our land claims legislation, which basically excluded that piece of land from restoration from anyone who was removed coming back. In the end, I was just, looking at the judgment, I actually found the judgment while sitting here. In the end, what happened, to cut a very long story short, what happened is and it all turns on participation, what you talked about and self-determination, what you talked about. In the end, we started in a conflictual situation, fighting because they really were just railroading, using strong arm tactics, our newly appointed government just wanting to develop low-cost housing, and on that basis, justifying all these other wholly inappropriate responses. In the end, we settled this case, but since it was one of the important land claims cases, the judges handed down judgment in terms of which that order was made a part of the judgment, the agreement. But the essence of the agreement was this flow chart that we agreed on, where it was about participation, it was about asking people what they wanted. And when they asked, when we reached that point where we were actually asking people what they wanted, the government, the provincial government realized that what they thought of as an insurmountable problem, that they would never be able to build the houses because these land claimants were effectively like a rock, like a huge rock on land, right? So that you couldn't build on it. What they realized by asking the question is that when people didn't actually want to come back, most of them didn't want to come back. They wanted other forms of restoration, other forms of restitution, but it all turned on participation, on asking people, and the issue that there's of determination. So I have to say that, at the time when we were in 1996, we weren't thinking along the academic lines of all the different concepts that you brought up today. But it's really, really, really interesting to think back all these years and what in practice that entire case really was about, and what we were doing with the people was basically ensuring that their right to participation, ensuring that their voice, that whole self-determination component was front and center. But thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you, please. My question is to Ms. Alan Babas. Now, when addressing this, the right social security and the social security, you have mentioned that some people are not access to medical services in the medical facility. Now, my question is, how do you think right now, do you think we can have the right time to have the national health insurance to cover even those common people who have no right access to medical facilities? Thank you.
Mine is just a comment on whether the private sector should support public social services. And my thinking is any development initiative should lead to the well-being of the people. And therefore, even if it is, maybe the government is supporting, but then there's a deficit. And then we are talking about private sector philanthropy. It should come in to fill in that gap. And there should be regulations or laws within that country that should be able to guide and ensure that then it is not used to exploit our people. And also the aspect of participation. Do they really want it? Even if it is philanthropy, then you're not coming from the global north and saying, oh, we are here to give you a charge. They really need that charge. Do they need that hospital? Maybe they don't even need it. They could be in need of something else. So for me, if whatever support the private sector or the philanthropists are giving is not leading to the well-being of our people, then that is a violation of the rights of that particular community.
Thank you very much for those very interesting presentations. Since I happen to be the person responsible for the drafting, at least the first draft of the convention, there are a few points that I wanted to raise here. The term equally important that you pointed out, Professor, in your presentation, actually is drawn from the Vienna Declaration. Yeah. The Vienna Declaration, as you are aware, came in the aftermath of the Cold War, when the capitalist communist blocs got together, and it was specifically inserted to ensure that civil, political, economic, social, cultural rights would be considered equally important, and no ideological schisms would dictate the prioritization of one over the other. So that's the textual normative basis for that insertion. Now, conceptually, I have to say that I feel a bit uncomfortable with two of the presumptions that I saw inherent in the arguments you raised about prioritization. I say uncomfortable because I haven't yet given finality to my thoughts on that issue. The first is the premise that prioritization of a set of human rights in national policies automatically militates against the principle of non-discrimination, or that all human rights are equally important. I think prioritization does not necessarily equate with a trade-off between different sets of human rights. And I'll come back to this point. And the second discomfiture that I felt is with the presumption or the premise that resources are limited. And I'll again come back to this point. On the prioritization aspect, as I pointed out, I don't think that it necessarily equates trade-off. The example I gave, what the right to development framework does not permit is a trade-off, right, between different sets of human rights. So the example I gave on Monday in my presentation was, let's say the government installs a water pipeline project in a rural part of a country because it's suffering from drought, but it does so in a way that takes away lands of poor farmers without any adequate participation, compensation, etc. So you're discharging one set of obligations, let's say right to water, but it comes in a way that violates another human rights. That's a trade-off, and that's not permitted. The right to development or the Draft Convention does not eliminate the possibility of prioritization. In fact, I would contend that it's inbuilt in the idea that individuals and peoples as the right holders are the ones that define the development priorities. If they have the right to define their development priorities, obviously they have the right to say that in a local context, the right to health, right to education, we need schools, we need hospitals. That's our development priority, rather than, let's say, an infrastructure project, a dam or a road that is important, but it's not necessarily a priority at this point. And the point I'm making is that prioritization can happen in a way where you prioritize certain rights, but it may not necessarily have to come at the cost of violating some of them. And that's my discomfiture with with the assumption that prioritization automatically means violating some other set of human rights. So, for example, with the public services delivery argument or the analysis that was made, it's absolutely clear that in the context of the African continent and many other countries where there's rampant malnourishment, hunger, for instance, I can talk about India. Certain public service delivery must be prioritized. But for that to happen, you also need equal respect for civil and political rights. You need a functioning government. You need the right government in place that's accountable. So you need all sets of human rights to work hand in hand. It's the same with the SDGs. And sometimes an argument is made that sustainable development goals are all equally important. They are, and that somehow doesn't permit prioritization. And that's not the case at all. Even in the case of the SDGs, for instance, a landlocked country may deprioritize the goals related to life under sea. That's their context, that's their reality. So prioritization is permitted, although all SDGs are equally important. On the point of resources, I agree with your argument that resources are limited, but only if we look at resources from an inward-looking perspective, right? So, for example, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, as is pointed out, does talk about maximum available resources, but it also says that states will discharge this obligation individually and through international assistance and cooperation, especially economic and technical. So if we look at the resources that are available to a state, the right to development framework is very important here because it talks about resources not just at the national level, but also through international cooperation and assistance. The resources are available. We have heard enough about ample times about how cutting down a small amount of contribution on the defense budgets of countries could help solve many of the problems related to hunger and malnutrition and education around the world. And I think one doesn't really need to go beyond the latest example of the crisis in Ukraine to see how all of a sudden huge sums of money, billions of dollars, are cashed out by the European countries and the United States, right? Out of nowhere. So it's not that money is not there; it is there. It's just in the wrong direction, and that's where the duty of international cooperation, according to me, is at the heart of ensuring that that prioritization does not lead to trade-off, right? If we look at national resources only, then yes, prioritization could lead to trade-off. But if we insist on the duty of international cooperation, it is aimed at ensuring that prioritization does not lead to a trade-off between different sets of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps rather than to expect me to read all the chats, those who would like to comment, I would suggest they do take the floor. Yeah. Is there someone online who would like to come in? If not, then I think we'll open a first round of. Yeah, no hand. Okay, there is. Yeah.
Thank you for the opportunity. Just I have two questions I want to ask. First of all, I'm Ayman Ibrahim Yahya. Ayman. So what is the relationship between the right to development in Africa and the sustainable development? So my second question is, how can the right to development in Africa to be implemented and monitoring? So my third question is that, what are the main challenges that facing the right to development in Africa? Yeah, just like this. Okay, thank you. I'm Ibrahim from Sudan. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so I suggest I give the floor back to the panelists. I think there was one specific question for you, so maybe you could start, and then I suggest you pick up whatever you would like to pick up as questions or comments. Please, go ahead.
Thank you, and great There was a question around national health insurance. There's a lot been talked about in terms of social insurance schemes, and they are important in making help, but they only go so far. We do still need to have functional public health systems. There are things that will not be covered. In Kenya, for example, they have national health insurance. So during COVID, the moment you got COVID, it was no longer an NHIS problem. So you are left, and I know this firsthand experience because I had an aunt where we were told she either goes to public health system or we look for the money for private. And I saw my cousin didn't make it because the time we were collecting the money, she was gone because the public lacked oxygen. They ran out of oxygen and she had to go to private and all of that. And my aunt, by this point, we had collected some money so we could do that. So that shows you the limits of that. It can complement, but it does not remove the responsibility. Also, how it's done, depending on whether or not, for example, you have, we've seen instances where there's been a whole lot of private providers who then collaborate and charge higher fees and drain the resources from the fund. It's a longer fascinating discussion we can get into. But getting back to the issues raised, someone raised the question about, the issue with private actors. It's just really a matter of regulation. So last year we met in Senegal. The African Commission convened experts and country representatives to talk about health and social protection. And the thing that cut across was the exorbitant pricing that happened at the heart of the Delta wave in many of our countries, because we just didn't have functional public health facilities, and the private were detaining people, holding dead bodies hostage. So you think about Kenya, it was like the same script. And the question then was, why didn't you regulate? Why did you have to regulate? In fact, in Uganda, there's a court case, and up to now, there's still no regulation around it. And part of the challenge is one, even if you effectively regulate, if you don't have public health facilities, you are not curing the problem. So one, you're absolutely right. The state has an obligation to regulate and an obligation to protect. But for that to have meaning, it must also be fulfilling, such that there's a functional public health system or public education system. The same issue with basic education. Many kids across Africa are still home even after schools reopen because they can't afford the charges. And the charges are going up. I mean, there's a cost of living crisis right now. So they also have to raise their fees and it keeps going. So to what extent you just keep telling them, sorry, you can't. You must also provide an alternative. But I was thinking a lot about the last question that was posed around the challenges and the right to development. And if you're government will always tell you it is funding. I disagree. I agree with you, funding is there. Whether we're thinking about how much we live to corporate tax to do, we live to financial flows, deciding to each money like we do. and usually goes down with different things. The real issue is a lack of political will. And I know as lawyers, most of us are lawyers, economists, we like to think about these things theoretically, like what happens, the obligation. Is how the reality is that the national case is cut according to political will. And who drives political will? It is the people, it is the voters. At the end of the day, and I keep saying this in Uganda, they or other countries, they will reach you in your different village to ask for a vote, but you will not have electricity or healthcare. They will tell you it's too far, you're too few, it doesn't make sense to extend the health facilities there. But they can go there for your vote. So how do you get these issues to be the subject of political action? How do you take these rights? Because I keep saying this, rights are entitlement. When someone is coming for something, if someone comes to your property, you will fight to protect your property, but you will fight to protect our healthcare or our education. And there's that gap between one, what the people think should be priority sometimes, and sometimes what the right language is. Or two, not indigenizing, like someone I think saying, these rights to, this is what people want. That means you've been looking at the participation of people in budgets, the participation of people in policy making. It will be a whole range of things. The thing I also think that undermines sometimes is fight. Is this progressive realization language? So much I hate it. And someone made a very good point that if you read progressive realization the way it should, an opportunity for the state to come back and actually provide accountability and deliver concrete strategies that I get all of that. But on the other end of it, our government stand and use this and say progressive realization. You know you can do it, progressive realization, but you don't progressively realize the military forces. You know what I mean? Like it's a tool to use. And I think that sometimes we're trying to look at our context, and the African Charter initially did not have this language. It was just not there. I don't think it was by accident, because of the time they were crafting it, there were other things. I don't think it was by accident. And so that's when we begin to see this tension within the human rights project, because again, it comes from a particular context. And what that means. In some contexts, we say the alternative to that is you must do this at minimum, but then who sets the minimum? So it's at the end of the day, I think if you're able to work with the people to make sure they have concrete actionable demand, then you'll move on this. Otherwise, we've seen a backlash. Human rights has faced a backlash, not just across, and it started, I think, even in Europe and America and a whole range of countries. And part of that was because there was such vast inequality. And then you come up with this seemingly theoretical demands that don't meet and the people's needs. So how you navigate that is really important.
Yeah, so I just actually want to comment on this issue of regulation, because the point has come up often that there is this obligation on the state to regulate, but I don't think we're too clear on what that obligation entails. So the obligation to regulate is firstly to establish regulatory standards. So this is, if I'm in the context of the right to water, what is the minimum amount of water I can be receiving every day? At what price will this water be made available to me? And then what quality, both scientifically, I can be receiving this water in. The other question is the issue of monitoring and evaluation. This is also critical. States generally establish the regulatory standard, but they don't implement the monitoring and evaluation or the enforcement of these regulations. And the last thing that I think, and this is the problem that's increasingly rearing its head in Africa, is the issue of regulatory capture. So it's good and well to establish an organization for regulating a social service, but increasingly what we're seeing is that many of these institutions are being captured by the very agent they are supposed to be regulating. So what this means is that the private water provider or the private school association is able to dictate what the regulations should be, how weekly they should be enforced, and sometimes they even supply the personnel. Or there's the problem of the revolving door. So an individual will manage the private sector water association, and then all of a sudden they're appointed CEO of the national water regulator. So these are the kinds of issues that we must address when we talk about regulation. Regulation is not just a buzzword. We need to be practical about how we implement it. And this is one of the things I think is really lacking, not only in Africa, but in many regions across the global south, where you have a high level of corruption or very low distinction between private sector interests and the influence and the management of the state.
Okay, so I'm gonna try and speak about sustainable development and what this looks like in context. So in Uganda there is a health partner, Rocket Health, so that does telemedicine, which provides access to healthcare at an affordable, and by affordable I mean really affordable, about 10,000 Ugandan shillings. And you can quality healthcare accessible to all, using USSD and things like that. Now, Rocket Health is an interesting case study in the ways in which development and the priorities of development work, because for so long, that model was considered not viable by funders, because they argued a country like Uganda, why is telemedicine important, right? That's one. The second example is Fundi Bots. And Fundi Bots is an organization that does STEM teaching, focusing on ensuring that the challenges that particularly low-income children have in access to education are mitigated. They too have faced significant challenges because they have been told that their models are not viable. You know, like, why do Ugandan rural kids need to be taught STEM and robotics, right? And so what happens is because of these very stereotypical understandings of what Africans need and when they need it, we continue to see Africans just left behind, right? We continue to see funding of transformative institutions that would significantly close the gap to access to health, to access to education and other key services, just not considered important because they don't fit specific understandings of what we need, right? And so I would like to argue that in thinking about sustainable development, we also have to expand our understanding of the needs, the desires, the aspirations of the people who serve, right? Particularly, I'm speaking to myself as well as a person who works in philanthropy. And I can attest to like the significant challenges of having to sit and convince funding partners that these are viable, that these are important as well, right? And I just don't think that development as it's done now has the potential, development work as it's done now has the potential to create the kind of catalytic, long sustainable changes that development actors say they want, right? I would argue actually that what it does is that it perpetuates a cycle of poverty porn, a cycle of inadequacy, just ongoing, that doesn't in actually just lead to anything substantial, right? So what's the solution, right? Because we can't despair. There's a unique opportunity, particularly because within development and aid work, people are repushing conversations like decolonizing aid, localization, etc., right? How do we move those from being buzzwords and things that we just throw around on panels to being things that we can actually actualize, right? The steps to do that, I don't have all the answers, but we can do it. And we have a unique opportunity now, especially because we realize with COVID, the importance of ensuring that local communities are able to respond directly to the needs of their own community, right? Because if COVID has taught us anything, it's that when crisis hit, local communities are left in charge of dealing with those crises. And so they have to be given the resources and access, not as a favor, but as an understanding that it's crucial if the transformation if the truest goal is actually transformation. And so that's why I think private philanthropy, not all, but the ones who are rooted in that analysis have the potential to contribute significantly within the next couple of years by providing not only access to resources, but access to access, right? To capacity, to spaces, to etc., where local visionaries who understand their local context and who have a plan on how they can mitigate some of these challenges can be able to respond.
Sorry, I just actually want to come back to this earlier point on trade-offs. I want to ask, and this is based off of the case you mentioned, Asha. What is the relationship between the principle of non-retrogression and this idea of there being trade-offs when we try and implement economic, social, and cultural rights? Something that I'm really interested in. Anyone can pick, please.
Okay, maybe I'll pick up also 2 points that were raised maybe in this first round. And I think one of the key elements of participation, where I fully accept, it was also the point made that in the Convention on the Right to Development, was draft convention, that in a way that people then have to decide on priorities. But at least something we also know from more sophisticated research on human rights based approaches is the question how you deal with power, and that it's easier said than done, that the people participate and decide, communities participate and decide, but very often all these power dimensions that are there tend to be neglected, or there is a risk at least. And so in that sense, I'm also a bit reluctant to see it too much as the solution to any problem of trade-offs and conflicts, if we do not then carefully also look into these questions. So that's a kind of a worry and a comment. Maybe the other point that I would like to take up is that I'm fully with you, right? That the question of whether resources are limited is a tricky one. You could already indeed say the decisions that are made on resource allocation within a national context, they can already make a huge difference. And so let alone if you then also look into the question of kind of a global solidarity and globally available resources. My hesitation there is, and again, I try to just think of the discussions we often have with practitioners, is that that doesn't solve the problems that are there. It's nice to say, well, there is we need global solidarity and we need international cooperation, but that does not help you if you as a development practitioner have to make decisions on priorities within the next year or within the next 3 years. And I think that's part of the tension that we often feel and have, that of course it could be that the solution lies in spending much less on armed forces and more on education, but even that will be a struggle. That's not a given. And so very often I think in practice people will then have the rather short-term pressure to nevertheless prioritize the other. I think, and for me these are parallel tracks and strategies. Part of it is that you indeed and also work also much more politically, I think, and much more structurally on these basic questions of international cooperation, for example, but also resource allocation within a certain state and so on. Okay, but so we had meanwhile a question to the audience, I think. So anyone who wants to take up Thomas's question, please. And we need a mic, yes.
Thank you. I'm actually not going to go directly to Thomas's question, but again, the last sentence from you about resource allocation and the development priorities and all of that. Reading this case again reminded me that, because I read the judgment again, and it reminded me that the reason why the provincial government decided to invoke this very draconian section in the Land Restitution Act was exactly this. They said that if we didn't, accept the emotion that I felt, I was 28 years old when I represented the clients in this case. The emotion is right back. I'm right there all over again. Because what they said, and these were previous comrades, can you imagine? I was in the anti-apartheid struggle. These were previous comrades that we were now litigating against. It's the provincial government, but the people were in the struggle against apartheid. And their argument was that if we don't deal with this problem of land tenures, our funding will be withdrawn. The funding that the Cato Development Association had received for that housing project would be withdrawn. And this was their argument. And we then had to, again, as you said, the power dynamic was a really, really important matter. Even though we had numbers on our side, thousands of claimants, with the question of how do you actually get this information from them? How do you consult with them? That's why I said that at the end of this entire process was a flow chart. It was about addressing exactly that issue, taking the time and the effort and the resources, securing the resources to actually do this properly. You know, I used to run a university-based law clinic at the time. And it was about training a whole lot of university law students, getting a whole lot of lawyers who would operate pro bono. And so it wasn't securing international funding or grants or anything like that. And within 25 days, 25 working days, that was the agreement. Within 25 working days, we consulted each one of these top 1,000 people, explained to them the options, and then we got that information down. Why I'm sharing this is because when we, coming to your point about asking people what their priorities are, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes a range of other aspects, commitments to the people, and really being there with them. Right now I feel their absence sitting here. I kind of, in this convention center, I sort of feel their absence. Because one of the things, again, on that development priority that you were talking about and who actually decides, another group of people that we represented, here were we thinking that, domestic violence is a problem in this community, and what we needed to do was to get protection services and this and that and a range of different ideas that we thought the women needed. But do you know what they needed and what they wanted? Street lights. Because in that informal settlement, the time when they were most vulnerable was when they went to the toilet at night. They had to walk through dark areas, and that's when they were attacked. Street lights was what they chose. It's not what I would have imagined would be the solution to domestic violence, to gender-based violence. Who could even dream that street lights is what women would ask for? But that's what that particular community asked for. And then it was our job to advocate for it, even if it sounded unreasonable, but to actually advocate for it and make sure that their voice is heard. It doesn't answer your non-derogation question, but I really felt that in the context of this debate, this discussion about resources and allocation and all of that, that this point needs to be made. Thanks for your indulgence. Letting me talk for long.
Thank you. Just very briefly, I think on the point of prioritization and the right to prioritize with the right holders, I think it's a bit more grounded in reality around the world that we see than we would like to believe it is. In terms of the equation with power, I'll give you 3 recent examples where people have challenged the deprioritization of their objectives. One is in the Rio Olympics in Brazil. the Brazilian government raised taxes on public transportation to raise funds for constructing the stadiums. People in Brazil across all strata were in protest. They protested, and those protests were carried out, were much in the newspapers. What were they protesting against? They were essentially protesting against the fact that their development priorities are not reflected in the policies of the government. Second example, the recent farm laws struggle in India, right? The government of India comes up with a law which is about amendments to the farm laws, and arguably was a good law in terms of its intent, but done entirely without consultation with the farmers. Came from the top, right? Some policymakers sat together, they conducted a study, came up with law, no consultation, no participation of the right groups. For an entire 2 years, the farmers crippled the North India's transport system. They blockaded the roads from Delhi to upwards. And ultimately, the Prime Minister of India had to come on TV and say, I apologize, I did not consult you, right? So this is an example, a grounded reality example of how people can challenge the fact that their priorities are not reflected. The most blatant example, I would say, would be the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, again, was an example of people going on the street, challenging the mighty powers that be on the ground, that their development priorities are not reflected. So I often say that right to development is one of those rights that is most demanded, but never actually employed in those very words. I also want to throw in another angle or dimension to the discussion on prioritization and also resource allocations, which is the global economic context. And I keep coming back to the global context and trying to push this discussion away from only a national dimension, because that matters. There are many examples of countries who have taken loans from the IMF. Costa Rica recently is in the process of negotiating because it crippled from as a result of the pandemic. One of the conditionalities of the IMF is cut down on your social spending. And that generally is health and education, right? So the resource allocation decisions by Costa Rica are not really based on availability of governance space or policy space. They are limited because of conditionalities that can come from a limiting international environment, right? So those are also factors I would like to just push into this discussion gently in terms of the resource allocation. So the non-retrogression question that was asked, I think non-retrogression is basically the principle that once a state accepts or ratifies a particular human rights treaty, it would not revert back to the maximum standards it already had, right? It shouldn't go below those standards that it already has. It should, in fact, comply with the higher standards that you have. And my reading of international human rights law is that prioritization is in fact permitted, not just permitted, it's in fact required under certain circumstances, especially when vulnerable groups cannot live another day. But there is no theoretical or practical incompatibility between prioritization of human rights and the principles of non-discrimination or rights being equally important. I think it is possible to avoid a trade-off and yet prioritize. It is possible.
So what you talked about have been honest conversations as well, because we talk about participation, and I just say there's definitely a power imbalance. One, for just sometimes lack of access to information, and therefore you ask people if this is what they're used to, and so they're normalized to accept, maybe that is all they will ask for because they don't know they're entitled to more. No one has access to these contracts, for example, or a lot of loan agreements. Other things, we had a voucher project which was supposed to help poor mothers get these vouchers after something. No one knew what it was about. So it was mismanaged because they didn't know what to ask for. But when there's such a power imbalance, particularly when it comes to creditors, I think human rights instruments today should decisively address the human rights obligation, the territorial ones, not just states, particularly donor states, but even entities like the IMF and World Bank, because that is really where all the craziness is happening right now. You know, people recently released a data human rights who argue that they do have human rights obligations, and they have stopped them to some extent. But then again, you're right with it, and you're looking, you know, imagining a case to bring and you don't have strong backing. And I think this is where the right to development and this convention could really make a difference, because I think everyone has started around the issue. It's also when you think about a number of states that, for example, have very harmful policies around just such a form of privatization in some of our countries as part of their foreign policy. Again, no one is talking about this. It's an issue because of human rights, and the Biden treaty hopefully bring that out. But I think when I look at this draft charter, I don't think that is sufficiently answered for me, and I think it's a different thing. I also do think it helps to maybe string a bit more to your side, to articulate certain things that have to be in place, such as participation is almost a way to get there, and of course can shape the discourse on how to fine-tune the details. But there's a general sort of like this aspiration that must be made. That's because I think, again, I have said, participation can take many forms. In countries like ours, where we often feel disenfranchised, sometimes we use the court process to force participation. I used to do that, and in case we remember our cases, we ask the structure into this. Go consult with and report back to court, and then they're forced to engage with you, because otherwise they just won't. They don't have time to participate, you know. But we're only able to do that if we know that there is this thing that is right, and maybe the modality of how it's implemented would be the question, but it's without question that it's right, or it's something that they're entitled to. And maybe whether or not they do 20,000 this year with the 50 is where the participation center. So I think we could do a lot more to strengthen human rights law on trying to make sure we flesh out what we're entitled to, particularly on these things that maybe are to see, but also in terms of the obligations of these financial institutions, because it shapes our world.
And so, for example, let's give an example like Uganda. So Uganda right now has a crisis in terms of education because COVID hit, schools were closed for 2 years. And right now we're having conversations around funding to education has been cut because, you know, funding has now moved. Our priorities are on climate crisis, which are important, the health, which is still important. And so we're saying there's not enough to fund education. And my argument is that that's such a dangerous way of prioritizing one. But also, I would like for us to begin to make the connections about why these crises emerge, right? A country like Uganda that went through structural adjustment policies that completely reshaped the ways in which education was experienced, right? And these are policies that were forced on us by these financial institutions, right? So you have health education, etc., being significantly affected, having already marginalized groups of people, women, poor people, etc., further having difficulties having these access. And then you have COVID, and then schools are closed for 2 years. And suddenly it's no longer a priority, right? It seems, and the ways in which now the education crisis is being framed, it doesn't link the origin of that crisis, right? There's no accountability that these financial institutions have at this point, right? The funding priorities have shifted. And now, guess what? It's the Ugandan girl, the Ugandan teenage girl, the Ugandan poor mothers, and the poorest families that have to fit with these realities, right? And it's important that we begin to call to action these financial institutions that play such a significant role in our development agendas, and yet they're completely devoid of any real accountability. how we do that, I think is a different conversation, but I think it's important to begin to name the root causes of the crises that we see now in our countries in connection to access to key services.
Thank you very much. Thomas, you may have noticed that we are kind of drawing to a close. If there's a kind of concluding comment or point you would like to make before I try to wrap up the session, I would like to give you the floor too. But if not, that's fine too.
Actually, maybe I can come on this point.
Sure.
And this is also an issue that comes up quite extensively in the general comment. In chapter 6, we identify human rights obligations or human rights consequences for two kinds of actors. The first are private actors at the domestic level, but also we speak about human rights consequences for actors other than state. And here we address actors like the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, act expressly from two angles. One, we express some of the expectations imposed on these entities, but also with respect to states that are members of these organizations. These states have human rights obligations, and because these obligations are extraterritorial in nature, they are required to ensure that when they transfer their decision-making or participate in decision-making in some of these organizations, they must not contribute to the detriment, to the decline of human rights. And this is one of the ways the state can begin to attempt to restrain international financial institutions, but of course, the number of practical problems involved in that as well.
Thank you very much. So maybe a couple of points that we may want to take home from this panel, which kind of is a closing panel of the whole week, and at the same time the opening panel of the roundtable dialogue. But I think one point that was made and correctly made, I think, is that we shouldn't jump to conclusions that it's all about conflicts of priorities. The first question is whether we really have these conflicts or trade-offs to be made, and I think a lot of the debate went into that direction. Bringing in the global context, the structural factors, the many players that partly also set the context in which decisions are made, and so I think that's a point well taken as far as I'm concerned. And by the way, for the last 20 years or so, I've been working on extraterritorial obligations and obligations of non-state actors and so on. So it's really an important topic that I think also nicely came up in as part of the concluding session of the week, because throughout the week that has been an important element also of this course. And then there is the question: what if we face these conflicts of priorities? And they're clearly, and I don't think that was the key point made, that in one way or another, we can't talk about prioritization or conflicts of priorities, but the question then is, how do we go about it? To what extent does human rights law also offer guidance to address conflicting human rights, not just conflicting development priorities, but conflicting human rights? How can we address it? And what is, for example, also the role of participation in that? I think was also a discussion on its own that we had throughout this panel. And maybe the other topic that was not explicitly on the agenda, but that cut across the whole discussion, was the question of actors, where clearly, although I think there is the strong emphasis on the role the state should play under human rights law, at the same time, we talked a lot about other actors, and so part of the debate seems to be how strong do we want the state to be to live up to its obligations, in particular, to deliver also on its obligation to provide human rights, and in particular ESC rights. The other part is to what extent do we want other actors than the state also to have human rights obligations, and what kind of human rights obligations do we see for them, given their role in the first place in deciding how much policy space there is for states on a number of elements. So I think we had a very rich discussion that really certainly was, as I understood it, a very nice concluding session of the whole week, and hopefully also will have raised points that we will take up also in the roundtable dialogue that we continue tomorrow. And then I think we are a couple of minutes ahead of time, but that should be fine too. For once, not to be over time, but to be a bit to be ready a couple of minutes earlier. And so I'm happy to hand over, I think, first to the Master of Ceremony, and the Master of Ceremony will probably hand over then to the next speaker. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, Professor Walter, for the first session, the presentation that you made, but also the moderation. And we thank our panelists. Please, a hand of course for wonderful discussion on an issue that, like Prof said, is really key and in a way wraps up a lot of the conversations that we've had. Maybe not wrap up, but maybe open up more questions than answers on some of these issues. But we do know it's a continuing exercise and discussion. So, yeah, at this point, closing, but we also, as it had been introduced in the beginning by Prof. France, we have Dr. Geraldine with us, who is going to issue closing remarks for the entire week. And it's the first time I think Doctor is doing the closing. She was always with us on the opening, but we thought having the roundtable, but also having the course and the roundtable at the same time, it would really be good. And we appreciate the time you've given us, sat through the whole conversation, so you can make maybe your remarks around the opening session of the roundtable, but also offer closing remarks for the participants, both online, but also the physical participants. So you're welcome to give the closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you are still alive and kicking after a very long week. One of the reasons also why this year I did not do the opening was because Monday in Belgium was a public holiday. And usually I would say, okay, it's fine, I will skip this public holiday. But now I thought, let me just exercise my right to have this public holiday. So luckily there is also the round table. And it's also nice to do the closing, obviously. But then also you might run the risk to repeat a lot of the things that have already been said during the week. I think, as Professor Viljoen already said, Government of Flanders supports 3 of the advanced human rights courses organized by the Center for Human Rights. This week's course is one of them. The other course is sexual minority rights, and then also the African human rights systems in comparative perspective. And we've done so since 2012. So a long time already, a long-standing cooperation, and we're very happy and very proud of this cooperation. And our involvement with the Center for Human Rights is very productive. It's a very productive partnership, which actually goes further than just our financing of the course logistics. It also comprises an active participation, an academic exchange between the Center for Human Rights and 3 universities in Flanders, a relationship that has produced very fruitful collaborations between South Africa and Flanders, including joint research and publications. And I'm very delighted that this week we had a lot of lecturers actually from the University of Antwerp that have participated in the course. Obviously, the fact that it was a hybrid course facilitates that more people from Flanders could actually participate. And I would like to thank the lecturers from the University of Antwerp, but obviously all the lecturers from South Africa as well, and the African continent for this interesting and stimulating program, which deals with a very topical subject matter. The commitment to respect, guarantee, and implement human rights underlines both the domestic and the international policies of the government of Flanders. It is our belief that upholding human rights lays the groundwork for peace, security, economic and social progress throughout the world, thereby contributing to a safer and better international order, as well as advancing the interests of all individual states and regions like Flanders. Human rights are also central to the development cooperation agenda of Flanders in Southern Africa. We support the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development by funding programs and projects that strive to further the Sustainable Development Goals. And our support to the Center for Human Rights fits into both these frameworks. The Development Cooperation Program of Flanders aims to realize the right to development of poor and vulnerable communities and populations in the Global South, using, and it has been mentioned before, a rights-based approach, focusing on partnerships and inclusion, and departing from the leave no one behind principle to shape our practices on relevant, efficient, effective, impactful, and sustainable development cooperation. But what exactly does this entail in practice? And there's an ongoing debate around the role of donors in the development of the Global South. And Ms. Patricia already alluded to it. And I think a lot of what she said about issues, or you're there, issues with private donors obviously also apply to public donors like Flanders and other countries. The role of donors has not always been a positive one, and I'm sure that you have discussed that during the course of this week. And this raises difficult questions. Questions about power balances, funding which comes with prescriptive conditions, and in the field of academia, which includes these advanced human rights courses, the argument for decolonized curricula at universities, to name but a few. The terms donor and development cooperation in themselves are problematic. It implies a one-directional transaction in which the recipient is rather restricted and that they have little or no control over who their donor will be, neither what the donor will transact or how development or progress actually looks like. This one-directional approach has for many years dominated the perspective of donors who have traditionally viewed themselves as benefactors only. However, as stated in the declarations on aid effectiveness of the recent years, the right to development means precisely that. It is a fundamental right, not something to be graciously bestowed. Furthermore, benefactor and beneficiary can and should be interchangeable terms. The ultimate rationale is that we all share this planet. When some of us are left behind, we are all damaged. Everyone has the right to development, and conversely, everyone has the duty to ensure that it is enforced. The dynamic is complex and must evolve. However, development cooperation, or international cooperation, as we in Flanders recently started calling it, it remains vital so long as the right to development is not fully realized amongst all people. Flanders firmly believes that development and human rights are inextricably linked. Development which transcends a socio-economic agenda cannot be achieved in the absence of human rights, while human rights likewise cannot be realized until sufficient levels of development are attained. For it to be effective, then, international cooperation must hinge on a relationship or on a partnership in which all parties each bring something to the table. One partner might have financial resources, whilst the other partners dispose of valuable knowledge, contextual insight, capacity, human resources. We need to reflect on how the roles can be altered by acknowledging the barriers inherited from the past and changing the relationship between the parties towards reciprocity and shared responsibility. Flanders has implemented various strategies to promote effective development cooperation, and we are constantly reflecting on our role. And these strategies include verifying that aid is demand-driven, focusing on building capacity and fostering sustainability, and mainstreaming human rights into our development cooperation as a whole. We are committed to supporting programs such as the Courses of the Center for Human Rights, which build capacity in actors in the South, based on choices made by those same actors. Our cooperation is thus of mutual benefit, as it provides opportunity for exchanges which enrich all parties. The fact that the lecturers from the University of Antwerp participated in this week's course facilitates such interaction. These courses are an ideal opportunity for them to interact with academics, students, and practitioners from the South, and of course, the converse is equally true. It is obviously one thing to talk about new and evolving international cooperation, but we are all cognizant that words can frequently mask empty promises and futile resolutions. At the same time, words are the stepping stones towards dialogue, and dialogue is an essential precursor to positive action. To be effective, dialogue requires interaction, mutual respect, exchange of ideas, the equal footing of the interlocutors, and the ability to listen to each other. At the end of the day, sustainable development is a universal responsibility, require an opt-in by governments, multilateral institutions, the private sector, civil society, academia, knowledge and educational institutions, as well as individual citizens and their communities. I hope that these factors have been integral to your discussions this week. I furthermore trust that this course has stimulated and challenged you, that you will continue to engage in dialogue and critical reflection, that you will constantly and constructively question the status quo, that the right to development will always be at the heart of your work as you explore and redefine what it means to achieve sustainable development. Thank you very much, and good luck with the rest of your journey.
At this stage, I will do evaluations. So I've shared the link earlier on your emails. So please do participate. We'll take how much time? Okay, no problem. Okay, so the form has been shared. Either way, the certificates will be sent virtually for everybody, even the physical class, unfortunately. Sorry about that. No Next is. Okay, and then at this stage, I will also request that you put on your videos. So I can take a few snapshots. Thank you very much. Okay. With all that, we have come to the end of the 5th day, right? But please remember, this roundtable continues until tomorrow. So tomorrow we also have a full day. So please log onto this system, not this platform, not the one that we were using for the course. So we'll be here tomorrow for the last part of the roundtable. So with that, thank you so much for everything. Thank you for your participation. And thank you so much, the speakers. Thank you, professors. And we shall see you tomorrow. Thank you so much. So the one that was